A neighbor sabotaged the farmer's crop, but 1 week later, military trucks arrived with a shocking court order. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. In the early hours of a crisp autumn morning, a low mist clung to the rolling fields of Evergreen County, where Henry Carson's modest farm sprawled beneath a pale sky. Henry, a wiry man in his late 50s, woke to the same routine he had followed for decades. Brew a pot of strong coffee, lace up his worn work boots, and head out to inspect the crops that had sustained 4 generations of Carsons. But this day promised an unwelcome surprise. As he stepped onto the porch, Henry breathed in the sharp scent of dew and damp soil. Something felt off. Perhaps it was the stillness of the morning, or the faint crunch beneath his boots as he descended the porch steps. When he reached the edge of his largest wheat field, his heart dropped. A wide swath of green had withered to sickly yellow, stripped and flattened in an irregular path. Like a scar across his land, the damage was impossible to ignore. He knelt down, sifting soil between his calloused fingers. The earth was strangely moist, with a chemical tang that made him recoil. This was no accident. Someone had sabotaged his crop. Henry stood in stunned silence, scanning the horizon as if expecting to find the culprit skulking at the field's edge. Instead, there was only the slope of farmland and a line of distant oaks bristling in the breeze. "Dad?" came a voice from behind. His daughter, Marjorie, approached with worry etched on her face. She had her mother's keen eyes and an eagerness to prove herself on the farm. "What happened?" Henry swallowed the anger rising in his throat. "I don't know," he said, standing upright. "But we're about to find out." Rumors in the close-knit farming community spread fast. By midday, half a dozen neighbors had stopped by to inquire, each offering a different theory. A rogue ATV tearing through fields at night, fertilizer gone rancid, or malicious mischief from bored teenagers. Yet Henry suspected something more deliberate. He kept noticing side glances and guarded whispers whenever Calvin Miller's name arose, the neighbor with whom Henry had exchanged heated words just a week before. Only last month, Henry and Calvin had clashed at the county water board meeting over an irrigation canal. Calvin insisted on diverting more water for his newly expanded orchard, leaving Henry's wheat field struggling in dry spells. Henry had refused to sign off on the plan, and Calvin left that meeting with a glare that practically spelled out trouble. Now, with half of Henry's crop in ruin, the tension felt more menacing than a mere neighborly feud. Marjorie paced the porch while Henry called the local sheriff's office. A deputy arrived in an old squad car that rattled up the dirt driveway, and she listened politely as Henry described the discovery of the slimy residue on the soil. The deputy took notes, brows furrowed. "Mr. Carson," she said, closing her notebook, "I can't promise anything yet, but I'll gather what samples I can. If it's chemicals, we'll see if they match anything purchased locally. Meanwhile, keep an eye out at night. And maybe think if you have enemies." Her hesitation suggested she already knew the name Henry had on the tip of his tongue, but the deputy had no evidence, no proof. When she drove away, Henry felt the weight of frustration settle in. Nothing about his quiet life had prepared him for the possibility of sabotage. A neighborly spat, yes, but wanton destruction? That seemed far beyond the pale. Still, the hollow look of the withered crops reminded him that the line between a small grudge and a deliberate crime was thinner than he'd hoped. That evening, as the setting sun turned the sky pink and gold, Henry and Marjorie set up makeshift security measures, a pair of trail cameras near the fence line and motion sensor lights around the barn. The farm dog, Jack, was let loose to patrol outside. Yet as Henry lay in bed, he couldn't shake the sense that someone wanted him scared, quiet, and possibly ruined. He only wondered why. The next day brought more questions than answers. Henry spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, who in turn asked for police reports, soil analysis, and a half-dozen documents Henry couldn't dig up on short notice. The fiasco threatened the Carsons' financial stability. The destroyed patch of wheat represented a chunk of their annual income. If the sabotage spread, they might lose everything. Marjorie proposed a direct confrontation with Calvin. "He's never been shy about giving you dirty looks," she said. "And I saw him lurking near the property line last week. Maybe he'll slip up and admit something." Henry refused. "I won't go accusing him without proof. We do that, we'll just end up in a shouting match. Besides, if he's behind this, what's to stop him from doing worse?" The father and daughter parted ways for chores, each weighed down by worry. Henry fed the livestock in the western barn, while Marjorie climbed into the old pickup and headed to the supply store in town. There, she found more than just tractor parts and seed. Eavesdropping on a conversation by the register, she caught a snippet of Calvin's voice complaining about that stubborn Carson not learning his place. A clerk asked him to keep his voice down, but Calvin was fuming. "He'll regret crossing me," Calvin muttered, just loud enough for Marjorie to hear as she ducked behind a display of work gloves. The venom in his tone made her blood run cold. She grabbed the supplies and left quickly, her mind churning with equal parts anger and fear. That night, under the hum of the single porch light, Marjorie told her father what she had overheard. Henry sighed heavily. He had dreaded confirmation of Calvin's involvement, but hearing it unsettled him in ways he could hardly describe. 2 days later, the situation escalated. Another portion of the crop showed signs of poisoning, and both Henry and Marjorie glimpsed a dark truck speeding off the property at dawn. The license plate was caked in mud, unreadable. Yet in that fleeting moment they'd recognized the driver's silhouette. Calvin. Henry called the sheriff again, voice thick with frustration. Deputies came, took pictures, muttered about insufficient evidence, and left. It felt like a slow, agonizing dance around the truth. Everyone suspecting Calvin, but lacking the smoking gun that would lead to charges. Meanwhile, Henry's once thriving fields turned patchy and discolored in places, as though an invisible hand was stamping out his livelihood in measured steps. Neighbors whispered about the feud, about Henry's stubbornness, about Calvin's money and influence at the county office. Then came the rumor that Calvin had boasted of calling in bigger forces to handle the problem. The rumor made no sense. What bigger forces? But Henry dismissed it as idle gossip, the kind that circulated whenever local tensions ran high. A week passed since the first sabotage, bringing a swirl of stress and fear to Henry's doorstep. Then, on the 7th morning, the rumble of heavy vehicles jolted the farm awake. Marjorie, stepping outside with a coffee mug in hand, froze at the sight of a line of military trucks rolling down the main road. Tan camouflage paint glistened in the early light, and men in uniform peered out from the passenger seats. One after another, the vehicles lurched to a halt near Henry's fence. Jack, the farm dog, barked ferociously at the unfamiliar intrusion. Henry rushed to the porch, heart pounding, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. Military trucks? On his property? A uniformed man stepped out of the lead vehicle, a sheath of papers clutched under one arm. He surveyed the Carsons, who stood rooted in disbelief. Behind the man, a second soldier hopped down, gaze stern but not hostile, scanning the farm's perimeter as if expecting trouble. Henry placed a protective hand on Marjorie's shoulder, and she felt him trembling slightly. "Can I help you?" he called out, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm roiling inside him. The uniformed man approached, the gravel crunching under his boots. He nodded politely, though his expression remained serious. "You Henry Carson?" he asked. Henry nodded. "That's me. Mind telling me what's going on?" The soldier extended the papers, revealing an official seal stamped in bold letters. "Sir, I'm Captain Rainey with the Army National Guard. We've been issued a court order to secure this property. We need to talk." Marjorie's eyes widened. A court order? How could the military be involved in a local dispute? The neighbors who had come to gossip about sabotage never mentioned anything like this. Henry gently took the documents, scanning the first lines in disbelief. Though he struggled with the legal language, certain words jumped out at him. Injunction, eminent domain, federal interest, and references to a possible contamination hazard. "This has to be a mistake," Henry stammered. There's no contamination here except for what someone poured onto my fields." He glanced up from the paperwork. "Why would the Army care?" Captain Rainey exhaled, flicking his eyes from Henry to the discolored wheat in the distance. "Sometimes farmland becomes part of a federal investigation," he replied, voice calm. "We're here to carry out the court's directive. That's all I can say for now." A wave of confusion washed over Henry. This was bigger than a simple neighborly feud. Did Calvin somehow orchestrate the arrival of the military? That seemed unimaginable. Yet there the truck stood, engines idling, stirring up dust in the morning sun. "What's going on, Dad?" Marjorie whispered. Are they going to take our farm?" Henry clutched the papers tighter. He didn't have answers. Not yet. But as he gazed at the column of trucks, at the stern faces of uniformed men, and the official court order in his hands, he suspected that whatever was happening was about more than sabotage. It felt like a storm gathering overhead, one that threatened to upend everything the Carsons had known. In the hush that followed Captain Rainey's announcement, Henry's grip on the paperwork tightened until the edges curled beneath his fingers. He forced himself to read each paragraph, though the legal language felt like a foreign code. Words blurred together: environmental risk, emergency injunction, mandated containment. At last, he glimpsed an official seal from the federal district court. He could no longer doubt the seriousness of what stood before him. "What does this mean for us?" Marjorie asked, her voice trembling. She cast a wary eye at the uniformed men who had begun unloading equipment from the trucks. Some carried rolled fencing material. Others handled crates marked with stencils Henry didn't recognize. The entire farmyard buzzed with an air of urgent purpose that set her nerves on edge. Captain Rainey stepped aside to confer with a pair of soldiers. He returned looking somewhat apologetic, if still resolute. "Sir," he said to Henry, "I need you and your daughter to gather in the barn. The rest of my team will secure the perimeter. Once we've confirmed safety protocols, I'll explain everything I can." Henry's pulse hammered as a cold dread coiled in his gut. He wanted to protest, to demand an immediate explanation, but the sight of those trucks, lined up like a convoy on a mission, stopped him. They were far too official to brush aside with shouts. Reluctantly, Henry nodded. He guided Marjorie toward the barn, where they kept extra feed and an old battered radio perched on a windowsill. The soldiers followed at a respectful distance, though their postures warned they would not tolerate defiance. The barn's interior smelled of hay and warm dust. A single overhead light flickered as Captain Rainey motioned for them to sit atop a stack of pallets. His eyes flicked around the space, as if scanning for hidden threats. Then he cleared his throat. "Here's what I can tell you. A federal court has determined that a contaminant might be present in your fields, something that poses a potential health risk beyond your property. We're here to investigate the extent and secure the site. Until we finish, I'm afraid you won't be allowed to leave the farm." Marjorie inhaled sharply. "You can't just lock us down in our own home," she objected, though her tone held more confusion than anger. "Who even brought this to a federal court?" Henry felt the unspoken question echo in his mind. Was this the doing of Calvin Miller? Rainey pursed his lips. There was a petition filed with the authorities. It alleged that hazardous chemicals had been introduced into the environment. Once that happens, it's standard procedure to bring in the National Guard if there's a potential threat to water sources or surrounding farms. At this time, I don't have all the details, but I do have orders to quarantine the area until testing is complete. Henry's heart thudded. So wait, the sabotage my farm suffered made it look like we're responsible for contamination? That's backwards. We're victims of some maniac who's been dumping poison on my land. The captain's expression remained neutral. "You may well be the victim, sir, but the court order doesn't differentiate cause. It only states that potential toxins have been detected. We'll run our tests. If we find evidence of wrongdoing, we'll let the authorities know. That's the best I can offer." Marjorie folded her arms, trying to steady her trembling hands. "How long is this going to last? Our entire harvest could be ruined." Rainey glanced at the open barn door, sunlight shifting into dusty beams. "I can't say. A few days, a couple of weeks. Depends on the test results. Meanwhile, we've been authorized to restrict movement for public safety. I'm sorry for the disruption." Anger flared in Henry's chest. "Disruption?" he repeated, voice shaking. "My livelihood's on the line. That's more than a disruption, Captain." Rainey raised a placating hand. "I understand your frustration. I'm only doing my job." Henry pressed his lips together, swallowing a retort. He noticed Marjorie's anxious breathing and put a hand on her shoulder. They were both furious, but they needed a strategy. Shouting at uniformed soldiers wouldn't solve a thing. Their best hope, Henry realized, might be to cooperate while working behind the scenes to prove that this sabotage came from an external source, and that they themselves were not at fault. When they emerged from the barn, the scene around the house and fields was surreal. Soldiers unspooled tall wire fencing and erected signs that read, "No unauthorized entry," along the main property line. Others busily set up portable lab stations near the edge of the large wheat field. The entire operation ran with crisp military efficiency. Marjorie let out a shaky exhale. "Dad, look." She pointed toward the driveway where a black SUV had pulled up behind the line of trucks. A woman in a dark suit stepped out, her hair pulled into a tight bun. She conferred briefly with a soldier, who waved her over to Henry and Marjorie's direction. "Mr. Carson?" the woman asked as she approached. She flashed a badge for a moment, though it was gone before Henry could read the agency. "I'm Agent Willis, Environmental Crimes Division. I'd like to talk to you about the suspicious chemical presence on your farm." Henry recognized the name of that division from news reports. Federal investigators who probed illegal dumping or factories skirting pollution laws. This was no local matter anymore. "Agent Willis, please," he said, making an effort to stay calm. "I've told the captain my land was sabotaged. Someone's been spreading toxins on my fields, not me. I'd never jeopardize my own crop." Her expression was coolly professional. "You could be a victim," she allowed, "or an accomplice. Our job is to find out which." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here to accuse you, but I'll need full cooperation. I'd like to see any records of chemicals you've purchased, or any local disputes you've been involved in. As you might imagine, this kind of event rarely happens in a vacuum." Henry bristled at her insinuation. "You'll have my cooperation," he replied tightly. "I've got nothing to hide." By mid-afternoon, the farmland looked more like a restricted military site than a family homestead. The hush of everyday farm life was replaced by the drone of generators powering portable labs and the crackle of radio chatter among soldiers. A soldier blocked the entrance to the main road. Two more patrolled near the orchard, rifles slung casually across their chests. Fear gnawed at Henry's stomach. Fear that the rumors might be twisted beyond control, that the press or local officials would see only what they wanted. A farmer entangled in some heinous environmental crime. Marjorie stepped inside the house to rummage for the receipts and records Agent Willis requested, but stress made her movements clumsy. She knocked over a mug, watched it shatter on the kitchen floor, and sank down with a strangled sob. In that moment, she felt more powerless than she ever had in her life. The last place she wanted to be was a suspect in a federal investigation. Henry joined her, stooping to pick up the shards. "We'll get through this," he murmured, even as he questioned the words. "We'll prove it was sabotage. When they see we're innocent, they'll have to leave." Marjorie sniffed, brushing away tears. "Dad, we have no idea how far Calvin might go." She recalled the memory of him ranting in the hardware store, how his animosity thrived in the open. "What if he frames us so badly that the feds never believe us?" Henry rose, placed the broken pieces in the trash, and pulled his daughter into a gentle hug. "I've known that man for half my life," he said quietly. "Even if he hates me, I don't see how he could orchestrate something so massive. But if he's behind it, there has to be a trail. We'll find it." They heard a knock at the doorframe. Agent Willis stepped in, her voice echoing in the small entryway. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Carson. I'd like to review your documents." Henry waved her to the living room. He handed her the binder of pesticide logs and the meticulously kept records of every seed, feed, or chemical purchased for the farm. She studied each page with clinical detachment, scribbling notes as she went. Marjorie hovered near the door, uneasy with the notion of a stranger passing judgment on their entire life through columns of expenses. "When did you first notice the contamination?" Agent Willis asked without glancing up from her notes. Henry explained about the morning he'd found the destroyed patch of wheat, how the sabotage progressed over the following days, and how he'd seen a muddy truck speeding away around dawn. She listened with a measured nod, occasionally highlighting phrases in her notebook. It was impossible to tell whether she believed him. Finally, she closed the binder. "All right," she said. "We'll be testing the soil ourselves. Captain Rainey's men will remain on site to ensure no further contamination occurs. In the meantime, if you recall anything, any threat, argument, or suspicious event leading up to this, tell me immediately." "We will," Henry affirmed. "Just please don't treat us like criminals. We've done nothing wrong." Willis gave a curt nod. "If you're telling the truth, the tests will support it." Then she left, presumably to coordinate with the portable lab teams outside. The day stretched on, weighed down by frustration. No one from the farm could leave the property, not even to pick up necessary groceries. A supply truck arrived under the guard's supervision, delivering bottled water and ration packs for the Carsons. Henry was simultaneously angry and grateful. Angry that he was being treated like a detainee on his own land. Grateful that at least they wouldn't go hungry. Late in the afternoon, when the sun dipped low over the golden fields, Henry retreated to the tractor shed. There he rummaged through old boxes until he found an ancient flip phone he once used before upgrading to a smartphone. It still worked enough to power on. He plugged it into the outlet near a dusty tool rack, waiting patiently for its battery to charge. Then, with a stealthy glance toward the soldiers posted around, Henry slipped the phone into his back pocket. He was sure the official lines of communication were being monitored. He had reason to suspect that if he tried to contact local authorities or journalists on his regular phone, the call might never reach its intended destination. But the old flip phone was a hidden lifeline. If he could place a quiet call to the county agricultural board or to the local radio station, he might spread the word that the Carsons were being railroaded. As dusk swallowed the final glow of daylight, Henry returned to the house and pretended to prepare supper. He signaled to Marjorie with a meaningful glance, tapping the flip phone in his pocket. She swallowed, understanding. They needed to act carefully. For all they knew, the soldiers, or Agent Willis, were scanning every digital trace. When the household lights dimmed at bedtime, Henry waited for the hum of conversation outside to die down. Then, he flicked open the phone, pressed the power button, and dialed the one friend he trusted more than anyone, Molly Brandt, a fiercely independent reporter who'd grown up in the same rural community. She'd left years before to chase bigger stories, but still kept an ear to the ground in Evergreen County. If anyone could dig into the behind-the-scenes deals that Calvin might be brokering, it was Molly. The call rang once, twice, then a click. "Hello?" came Molly's voice. Henry could practically see her sitting in a cramped apartment, pen at the ready. He felt a surge of relief just hearing her. "It's Henry," he whispered, glancing around. "I need your help. Something's gone real wrong here." And with that, he spilled the short version of the sabotage, the sudden arrival of the military, and the looming suspicion that a vindictive neighbor had orchestrated it. Molly listened in terse silence. "Henry," she finally said, "you'd better sit tight. I'll see what I can find out about any lawsuits or federal orders. But be careful. Whoever set this in motion won't appreciate you snooping." "I know," Henry murmured. "I'll wait for your word. Just please hurry." Then he ended the call, snapped the phone shut, and felt the weight of this secret operation settle onto his shoulders. It was a risky move, but he wouldn't stand idle while soldiers and federal agents turned his life upside down. Outside, the steady rumble of a generator vibrated through the night, casting an eerie glow across the farm that once felt so peaceful. Henry stared at the swirling shadows on the wall, uncertain whether to feel hope or dread at the promise he'd made to fight back. So much depended on exposing the truth. He only prayed that when the revelations finally came, it wouldn't be too late for his family or for the farm they loved. Morning arrived with the rattle of diesel engines and the persistent thump of heavy boots on soil that Henry Carson once tended in peaceful solitude. Now his land resembled a makeshift base, peppered with National Guard vehicles and fenced-off testing areas. Through the kitchen window, he watched grim-faced soldiers gather near the portable labs, their breath forming ghostly plumes in the chill. Marjorie stood beside him, arms crossed, equally unsettled by the abrupt changes that threatened their way of life. Agent Willis knocked on the door promptly at 7, a thick folder under her arm. Henry invited her in with forced politeness, the tension between them palpable. Marjorie poured coffee in mismatched mugs. Willis declined, setting the folder on the kitchen table with a soft thud. "I've got preliminary results from our soil tests," she said, sliding a few pages toward Henry. "They confirm the presence of multiple toxic compounds. Some are common pesticides, but others are more concerning, including industrial solvents not typically found on farms." Henry skimmed the document. Though the chemical names were mostly unfamiliar, the references to banned substances were alarmingly clear. "We don't use anything like that. We follow county guidelines. Could someone have staged this to look like our fault?" Willis shrugged, eyeing him evenly. "That's a real possibility. Our job is to identify who introduced these compounds and why. I'd like to discuss your neighbors. Any long-standing disputes, especially those that might have escalated recently." The urge to accuse Calvin Miller surged, but Henry resisted blurting out the name without restraint. He explained calmly about the tension around irrigation rights, about the argument at the water board meeting, and the subsequent sabotage. He kept his voice steady, providing details without sounding spiteful. Willis jotted notes methodically. "Calvin Miller," she repeated at one point, pronouncing the name with a neutral caution. "I'll look into him. Thank you." Marjorie cleared her throat. "We have reason to believe he was seen near the property. My dad called the sheriff more than once." She hesitated, scanning the agent's face. "If you dig deeper, you might find records." Willis offered a tight nod. "I'll request the sheriff's incident reports. Meanwhile, we'll maintain quarantine until we know the scope of contamination." She paused, then leaned forward. "Mr. Carson, if the sabotage continues, or if you see suspicious activity, alert us immediately. The last thing we need is more chemicals introduced while we're investigating." As if on cue, Captain Rainey appeared in the doorway, knuckles lightly tapping the frame. "Agent Willis," he said, "they're ready for you at the eastern trench. We've discovered some barrels buried under a patch of disturbed soil. Looks fresh." Henry's eyes widened, a cold twist forming in his stomach. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to sink illegal chemicals into his farmland. If barrels were being unearthed, it implied a deeper conspiracy than a simple act of petty revenge. Willis stood, excusing herself briskly. Henry followed her to the porch, where he watched her stride across the yard, boots crunching on gravel as she disappeared behind the row of trucks. The early sunshine fell across a scene he barely recognized. Men in camouflage hoisting equipment, the hum of radio chatter, and a restricted area sign hammered into the ground. Each step seemed to push him further from the life he'd known. Marjorie edged up behind him. "Dad, do you think they'll charge us if they can't prove who planted those barrels?" He inhaled slowly, mind racing. "We have to trust that the truth will out," he said. But the reassurance rang hollow even in his own ears. "Whatever happens, we'll keep records of everything, and we'll get our story out if we have to." He thought of Molly Brandt, the reporter he'd phoned the previous night on that ancient flip phone. She'd promised to start digging into court filings and property records to see if there was anything suspicious about the petition that triggered this federal action. Though he hadn't heard back yet, the mere knowledge that someone on the outside was investigating offered a thin lifeline. Yet as the day wore on, the Carsons found themselves under near constant scrutiny. Soldiers stationed themselves by the barn and well, while scientists in protective suits probed the soil. Henry wasn't allowed to approach them. He could only watch from a distance, feeling like a trespasser on his own land. The tension grew unbearable when he saw the portable labs whisk sealed evidence containers into a truck. He wanted to shout, "You're carting away my life in test tubes." By mid-afternoon, a new arrival turned more heads, a black SUV with tinted windows that roared past the checkpoint, escorted by an unmarked sedan. From his vantage point near the house, Henry saw the vehicles parked beside the orchard. 2 men in suits emerged, federal agents of some rank presumably. Their expressions were grim as they conferred with Agent Willis and Captain Rainey. Whatever was discussed, it felt urgent. They gestured to the orchard's boundary, nodded toward the newly discovered barrels, and occasionally glanced Henry's way. After they departed, Willis approached Henry once more, her posture a shade more rigid. "It appears this situation may be part of a larger chain of events," she said. "I'm afraid I can't share details, but let's just say the contamination on your property is not an isolated incident in the region. Have you noticed any unfamiliar vehicles or people scouting your farm over the past year, other than Calvin Miller?" Henry's mind reeled. No, not that I recall. I mean, we get salesmen sometimes, or folks from the county extension office, but nothing stands out." Then a memory stirred. A group of men in suits months earlier who claimed to be from a foreign agricultural supply company. They'd asked oddly detailed questions about acreage and well depth. At the time, Henry dismissed them as pushy sales reps. Now his stomach flipped. "Wait, there was a group last spring," he murmured. Could they be connected? Willis pressed him for more details, scribbling every scrap of recollection. Henry cursed himself for not paying closer attention back then. If those men had been planting seeds of sabotage, he'd missed every clue. Sunlight slanted across the property, and the day slouched into evening. Captain Rainey's unit assembled near the orchard, long shadows stretching from truck tires across the dusty ground. In the distance, a crane rumbled into position, presumably to extract the buried barrels from the soil. An acrid tang hung in the air, a mix of disturbed dirt and whatever chemical residue lurked beneath. Restless, Henry paced near the orchard fence. A soldier eyed him, but he was too focused on the orchard's silent rows of fruit trees. He thought of how thoroughly everything had changed in a matter of days. He no longer felt at ease even standing on his own land. At length he retreated indoors, where Marjorie was flicking through channels on a small TV set, searching for local news coverage. She froze on an image of the farmland shot from overhead by a news chopper. Bold headlines crawled across the screen. Toxic chemicals found on family farm. Federal agents investigate possible environmental crime. Henry sank onto the sofa. "They're painting us as criminals," he muttered, watching the anchor discuss alleged wrongdoing with expert guests. The phrase alleged wrongdoing hung like a noose around his neck. No mention of sabotage, no suggestion of the Carsons being victims. It was all speculation about yet another example of farmland misconduct. Marjorie shut off the TV, eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, we have to do something. This will ruin our reputation forever. Who would buy our wheat or trust our brand if the media calls us toxic polluters?" He sighed wearily, feeling decades older than his 50-something years. "We need proof. Until we have it, all we can do is keep pushing our story." He retrieved the flip phone from his pocket, glancing at it with a faint spark of hope. "I'll try calling Molly again." Before he could dial, there was a sharp rap at the door. It was Captain Rainey, expression unreadable. "Mr. Carson, Ms. Carson," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "I'm going to have to ask you both to step outside. Agent Willis wants to conduct a thorough search of your house." Marjorie's eyes flashed with anxiety. "A search? Of what?" Rainey looked away, seemingly uncomfortable. "Standard procedure in a federal investigation. They'll look for any records or materials tied to the contamination. You can wait in the barn while they do it." Henry felt an eruption of anger, but he tempered it. They had no choice. They followed Rainey out, crossing the yard under the watchful eyes of several soldiers. Jack, the old farm dog, barked from a fenced kennel. Henry's heart ached to see his loyal companion penned up. Everything about this felt wrong. In the barn, Marjorie paced furiously across the packed dirt floor. "This is humiliating," she hissed. "They're going to rifle through our belongings as if we're criminals. How is it fair?" Henry placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Keep calm. Getting upset in front of them won't help." In the distance, he glimpsed Agent Willis leading a small team into the house, gloves snapping onto their hands as though preparing for a crime scene. Every fiber of his being screamed at the invasion of privacy, but the presence of uniformed soldiers reminded him this was beyond a local scuffle. They had the authority, for now. Time crawled. Sitting on a bale of hay, Henry gazed through the barn's open door at the sinking sun. Bright orange light slanted across farmland that once felt safe and familiar. He thought again of Calvin Miller, of the orchard expansions, of that monstrous scowl Calvin wore whenever he discussed water rights. Could one man's spite truly trigger a federal chain reaction? Or was there a deeper plot that merely used their feud as a convenient trigger? Footsteps approached. A soldier stood at the threshold. "You're free to go back inside," he announced tersely. Henry helped Marjorie to her feet, both filled with dread at whatever might be turned upside down in their house. Their steps were heavy as they trudged across the yard. Inside, they found scattered drawers, boxes rummaged through, personal files stacked on tables. Agent Willis stood near the fireplace, sifting through old photographs. She looked up, unblinking. "We found nothing incriminating," she said, though her voice lacked warmth. "At this point, the contamination appears external, but the official investigation continues." Without further words, she pivoted and strode out, leaving the father and daughter staring at the disarray that once was their home. Henry inhaled, fighting the urge to slam the door in anger. At least the search ended without fresh accusations. Still, he and Marjorie were forced to face how powerless they had become in a matter of days. As they tidied up, Henry's mind roamed ahead, picturing the farmland at dusk under military watch, the orchard lit by floodlights. He kept thinking of the barrels, the half-buried rumor of some bigger scandal, the strangers who visited months ago. At last, he sank into a chair at the cluttered table, picking up the battered flip phone. Molly had to come through. If not, the Carsons might lose everything to an accusation they couldn't shake. Marjorie's soft voice cut through his reverie. "Dad," she said, "when the phone rings, whatever news Molly has, we need to be ready. If Calvin's behind this, he might have bigger allies than we think." Henry lifted his gaze to meet hers. "We'll do whatever it takes," he vowed. "I won't let them steal our farm without a fight." Night settled over the quarantined property. A swirl of shadows in the corners and searchlights along the fence. Henry closed his eyes, haunted by the possibility that the truth might come too late. Still, a spark of hope glimmered in the darkness. He clung to that, determined not to let sabotage and powerful interests destroy the legacy his family had nurtured for generations. A restless night weighed on Henry, robbing him of real sleep. Each time he drifted off, he dreamed of silent trucks creeping over his fields, burying barrels of poison under moonlight. By dawn, he woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Marjorie was already up, standing by the window in her rumpled pajamas, watching the uniformed soldiers outside. Neither spoke. The past days had stolen their sense of normalcy, leaving them suspended in a fog of anxiety. The phone rang. Henry's old flip phone, not the landline likely monitored by the agents. He leapt out of bed, heart pounding as he fumbled to answer. "Hello?" he hissed, pressing the device close to his ear. "Henry, it's Molly," came the brisk reply. "I've spent the last 2 days wading through records, property transactions, and court filings related to your case. You might want to sit down for what I'm about to tell you." Henry nodded at Marjorie, who frowned with apprehension. They made their way into the living room, carefully shutting the door so no one could overhear. "Go ahead," Henry said, voice trembling. "Tell me everything." Molly's tone was all business. First off, the petition that triggered the federal injunction was filed under an organization's name, Green Guardians Alliance. But that group has no real public presence. I suspect it's a shell. When I dug deeper, I found it's connected to a local law firm known to represent industrial clients who want land cheap. And guess who that law firm's biggest client is? The Oakbridge Development Corporation. Henry tensed, recalling the rumor that Calvin Miller had once negotiated with outside investors. "Oakbridge," he repeated. "What do they want with farmland?" Officially, Oakbridge invests in real estate and infrastructure. Unofficially, they've been pushing for a large industrial project near your county. Something about a manufacturing facility that needs a reliable water source. If your land is declared a hazardous site, you'll be forced to sell for pennies on the dollar, or even face government seizure. Then Oakbridge could swoop in. Marjorie sank onto the couch. "That's monstrous," she whispered. "They'd poison our fields, pin the blame on us, then grab the land for themselves?" "Exactly," Molly said grimly. "And if Calvin Miller has ties to Oakbridge, he might see a hefty payoff if your farm ends up worthless. But I don't have solid proof linking him yet, just hints in county records that he's been meeting with Oakbridge reps." Henry's throat felt tight. He glanced at the door leading to the yard where soldiers still patrolled. "We need to make this public," he said. "We have to expose the conspiracy before they ruin us." Molly sighed on the other end. "I'm working on an article, but it won't be enough without concrete evidence. You mentioned federal agents are crawling over your farm. If they find barrels stamped with certain industrial markers or trace the chemicals to Oakbridge's supply chain, that might help. Meanwhile, I'll keep digging. Be careful, Henry. If these people went as far as burying toxic waste on your property, they won't hesitate to protect themselves by any means." He swallowed. "Understood. Thank you, Molly." He ended the call and stared at the phone in his palm, the weight of her words pressing down like a physical burden. Marjorie spoke first. "Dad, this is huge. We can't let them get away with it." "I know," he said, exhaling shakily. "But we need a plan. If we confront the agents, they might dismiss us as suspects trying to deflect blame. We need to guide them toward the real culprits without sounding like we're making wild accusations." In the hallway, there was a brisk knock. Agent Willis's voice carried through the thin door. "Mr. Carson, Ms. Carson, we need you outside to verify something." They exchanged worried looks, then stepped onto the porch, forcing calm expressions. Willis stood with a clipboard, flanked by 2 soldiers. "We've exhumed several barrels from under your orchard soil," she explained. "They're marked with partial serial numbers. Do either of you recognize these codes?" She held out photographs, corroded metal drums with stenciled letters barely visible. Henry frowned at the images. "I've never seen them before," he said truthfully. "I don't buy chemicals in bulk like that. My farmlands always use standard, approved pesticides in small quantities." Willis studied his face. "Any guess who might have access to industrial solvents in this area?" Marjorie's pulse quickened. "Oakbridge Development might," she blurted, before she could stop herself. Henry shot her a warning look, but it was too late. The agent's posture stiffened. "Oakbridge? Why do you say that?" Marjorie hesitated. "I've heard rumors they plan a big build nearby," she managed. "And we suspect our neighbor Calvin is in bed with them. He's got a grudge against us. Maybe they saw an opportunity." Willis's expression remained neutral. "Do you have any evidence connecting those barrels to Oakbridge, or is this purely rumor?" "It's rumor for now," Henry admitted. "But these days, rumor's all we've got to explain what's happening to us." He couldn't mention Molly's partial research, not without jeopardizing her efforts or sounding like a conspiracy theorist. He forced a steady breath. "Look, I just want you to know we have no reason to bury anything illegal on our land. None." Willis nodded slowly, flipping the clipboard closed. "If the lab results link the barrels to a specific company, we'll investigate further. For the record, Mr. Carson, you and your daughter remain persons of interest, but we have no direct evidence of your involvement. The quarantine stands until we finish analyzing everything." She left with her escorts, leaving Henry and Marjorie to stare at each other in the morning glare. "We have to push them harder," Marjorie said. "They're obviously suspicious of us, but if we don't speak up about Oakbridge, they might not pursue that angle." Henry ran a hand over his stubble, wrestling with the risk. "We can feed them more details bit by bit," he murmured. "We have to do it carefully so they see us as cooperative, not defensive." A few hours later, while Henry was in the barn checking on the animals, a sergeant approached, frowning at the goats penned near the far wall. "Hey, are these safe to keep around? We need to ensure they haven't been exposed to contaminants," the sergeant said, a trace of genuine concern in his voice. Henry bristled at the idea that even his goats were suspect, but he tried to stay courteous. "They seem fine. If you want to test their feed, go ahead. But those goats are part of the family. We don't intend to move them anywhere until this is sorted out." He couldn't shake the feeling of living in a fishbowl. Every corner of his property, every daily routine, was now subject to scrutiny. The presence of soldiers reminded him that the real power to end or extend this ordeal lay outside his control. By mid-afternoon, a commotion arose near the orchard. Henry and Marjorie hurried out to see men in hazmat suits rolling a large steel drum onto a pallet. A small forklift beeped in reverse, its tires leaving deep tracks in the damp soil. Captain Rainey, standing at the orchard's edge, barked directions. Henry strained to catch any detail. The suits, the care with which they handled the drum. None of it boded well. When they finished loading the barrel into a containment trailer, the forklift operator pulled off his helmet and turned to the nearest soldier. "Serial number's definitely partial," the operator muttered, "but looks like it originated from an industrial plant 2 states over." Henry's heart leapt. 2 states over. Maybe that matched Oakbridge's supply chain. Before he could step forward to mention it, the forklift operator and soldier moved away, leaving Henry with unspoken questions swirling. He returned to the house where Marjorie was pacing near the window. "Anything new?" she asked. He relayed the snippet of conversation and her eyes brightened. "That's good. If they can trace it, it might prove we never owned that stuff." Her voice carried more hope than Henry dared to feel. Night fell with an almost oppressive silence. Henry cooked a modest dinner of beans and cornbread, though neither he nor Marjorie had much appetite. They sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead bulb swinging gently as if reflecting their unease. Outside, bright floodlights lit the orchard, silhouettes of soldiers crossing back and forth. They washed dishes together, avoiding talk of the future. Henry had grown up on this farm, learned to drive a tractor before he could ride a bike. Marjorie, too, had anchored her dreams to the land. Yet now both faced the possibility that everything, every memory, every legacy, could be lost to cunning business deals and federal seizures. The dread lay like a heavy cloak over each minute. Late that evening, the flip phone vibrated again. Henry snatched it up, pressing it to his ear. "Molly?" he whispered, stepping into the narrow hallway for privacy. Her voice crackled. "I found a link. Oakbridge purchased certain industrial chemicals from a facility in the next state over, the same place you said might be the origin of the barrels. If your investigators confirm the serial number is from there, it's nearly definitive that Oakbridge had possession of those drums. They may have hired local muscle to bury them on your farm. Maybe Calvin arranged the introduction." Henry gripped the phone, adrenaline spiking. "So this ties Oakbridge to the contamination. If we get that info to Agent Willis—" "Wait," Molly interrupted. "I'm hearing rumors Oakbridge has connections inside local government. Some big players want this farm. You'll need more than suspicion to pin it on them. You need a smoking gun. The partial numbers won't be enough by themselves unless the feds see a direct invoice or shipping log connecting Oakbridge to your orchard." Henry's hopes wavered. "How can we get that?" Molly's pause was telling. "I'm working on it. There's a clerk in Oakbridge's legal department who might talk, but she's scared. For now, try to steer your agent to look deeper. The more pressure the feds apply, the more likely Oakbridge slips." Henry thanked her, ended the call, and slipped the phone away. He turned to find Marjorie standing in the hallway, arms folded. She'd overheard enough. "We have to do something," she said, voice low but determined. "We can't just wait for them to bury us." He nodded, though weariness settled deep in his bones. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We'll hint to Willis about Oakbridge's chemical contracts. Keep pushing that angle, so she won't let it go." Marjorie's eyes burned with resolve. "And if they ignore us, we go public ourselves. We'll raise a stink so big no one can brush it under the rug." They shared a brief, fierce embrace, aware that each passing day chipped away at their hopes. Outside, the orchard lights glowed relentlessly. Henry wondered if the darkness would ever lift from their land. Yet the knowledge that Oakbridge's name was now in play, that the partial serial numbers might lead to a breakthrough, offered a glimmer of possibility. If the investigation kept unraveling the threads, the Carsons might see vindication before it was too late. For the first time in days, Henry allowed himself a small, wavering spark of optimism. In a world where powerful interests twisted truths for profit, they had one advantage left: their stubborn refusal to be bulldozed. If they held on to that, maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail, and the farmland he loved would remain in the family, free of barrels and barbed wire. Tomorrow would be crucial, but for now, Henry breathed out a quiet prayer that truth would triumph over greed. The next morning, sunlight filtered through streaked windows, illuminating the scattered paperwork Henry and Marjorie had tried to organize on the kitchen table. A restless energy crackled in the air. They were halfway through their first cup of coffee when Captain Rainey knocked, stepping inside with a quick greeting and an uneasy expression. "Agent Willis will be busy off-site for a few hours," he explained, resting his cap under one arm. "She asked me to let you know that more soil samples need to be taken at the southern boundary. One of my teams will guide you there if you'd like to observe." Henry's pulse quickened. "Yes, I'd like that," he said, hoping a closer look at the testing process might yield clues. "Give me a minute to pull on my boots." Marjorie joined him, and they followed Rainey out to the yard, passing clusters of soldiers who were loading fresh test kits into a Humvee. The orchard glowed in the early sun, shadows stretching across a stretch of bare earth where barrels had been unearthed. Henry felt a fresh sting of anger at the sight. Those hidden drums threatened to cost him everything, from his livelihood to his name. A short ride took them to the southern fence line, where a narrow creek meandered. Soldiers hopped down with equipment, and one offered Henry a brief nod. "We'll be drilling a few inches down to check for groundwater contamination," the soldier explained. "Captain says you can observe, but keep your distance from the rig. Safety rules." Marjorie eyed the slow-moving water. "This creek feeds into the local watershed, right, Dad?" she asked. "If there are chemicals here, it'd affect more than just us." Henry grimaced. "Yes. That's why a federal response was so swift. Whatever's in the soil might travel downstream." As the drilling rig whirred, sending up loose dirt, Henry glanced at the soldier's laptop resting on a portable table. The screen displayed a set of site coordinates and data logs. He glimpsed references to pH levels, chemical tags, and something labeled possible industrial residue. The swirl of numbers meant little to him, but he knew the outcome might decide his fate. He used the downtime to approach Captain Rainey, voice kept low. "Captain," Henry began, "we have reason to believe Oakbridge development might be linked to those buried barrels." Rainey's eyebrows rose. "Oakbridge? That's a big corporation. Why would they target your farm?" Henry explained quietly about the rumored deals, Calvin Miller's vendetta, and how Oakbridge might want cheap land for industrial use. Rainey listened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "That's quite an allegation," he said. "Agent Willis is the one you should talk to." "She's not here," Henry replied. "Please at least pass along the tip. If these barrel codes trace back to Oakbridge's supply chain, it might blow this whole mess wide open." Rainey rubbed the back of his neck, appearing torn. "I'll inform her," he said at last, "but I can't promise how she'll handle it. She's methodical. Evidence speaks louder than theories." A faint beep signaled the rig's completion of the first core sample. Two soldiers carefully capped a long cylinder of soil, labeling it with a printed sticker. Henry watched them place the sample into a sealed box. If they found the same chemicals that had tainted the orchard, it would confirm a broader contamination. More proof that someone wanted to saturate his entire property. When the testing wrapped, Henry and Marjorie were escorted back to the house. As they walked across the yard, a different soldier jogged up to Captain Rainey, whispering something that made the captain's face harden. He turned to Henry. "We've just received word that a private security truck tried to approach from the western road," Rainey said. "They claim to be from Oakbridge Development, here for a property inspection." Marjorie's head jerked up. "Oakbridge? They're actually showing up?" Rainey nodded. "We turned them away, of course, but it's odd timing. They had no official documents, yet insisted they had rights to assess the land. Agent Willis will be briefed." Inside the house, Henry felt a spark of grim satisfaction. Oakbridge's blatant attempt to intrude might raise the exact suspicions he needed. Or it might fuel new rumors painting the Carsons as entangled in shady business. Uncertainty gnawed at him. He and Marjorie busied themselves straightening the living room and reorganizing the rummage through boxes, hoping to distract from the ever-present tension. By noon, the day's heat pressed down. Marjorie stepped onto the porch to catch a breeze, only to see Calvin Miller's pickup inching past the roadside barricade, halted by a soldier brandishing a stern face. Calvin's distinct hat poked out the window as he argued with the guard. Henry joined Marjorie, a coil of apprehension twisting in his gut. He couldn't hear the conversation, but the anger in Calvin's gestures was obvious. Within minutes, a soldier escorted Calvin toward the house. He marched up the porch steps, pushing past the soldier's cautioning hand, confrontation in his glare. "Henry," he spat, voice thick with resentment, "your mess is bringing the army into everyone's business." Marjorie bristled. "Our mess? You're the one who's been at odds with us. How dare you come here, demanding anything, when you might be the reason this entire fiasco started?" Calvin's eyes narrowed. "What are you accusing me of, girl?" he snapped. "I never buried toxins, but you're sure stirring up trouble. Oakbridge men say you've been throwing around accusations, trying to block development that would bring good money to this county. Henry stepped between them, speaking low so the soldiers wouldn't overhear every word. "Calvin, you can't expect me to believe you had nothing to do with this. You've hated me ever since I opposed your irrigation plan. Did you invite Oakbridge to sabotage my fields so they could buy me out cheap?" Calvin's nostrils flared. "That's insane. I've considered selling my orchard to Oakbridge, sure, but I don't need them poisoning your land. If your property gets condemned, it'll hurt the whole region's reputation, including mine." Marjorie's lip curled. "You threatened us more than once. You said we'd regret crossing you." His cheeks burned red. "Threatening a man in anger's different from burying toxic waste. If you think I'm behind that, prove it." He turned to leave, then paused. "And if you want to keep slinging accusations, be ready to face a defamation suit, Carson." He stormed off, escorted by a watchful soldier until he vanished down the driveway. Henry exhaled slowly, aware that any hope of an amicable resolution between neighbors had died long ago. Agent Willis reappeared late that afternoon, dust trailing behind her SUV. She parked near the barn and motioned Henry over. He strode across the yard, heart thumping. Maybe she had news. Marjorie followed closely, bracing herself for another interrogation. Willis leaned against her vehicle, arms folded. "We've had a development," she said. "Your neighbor, Calvin Miller, just visited the county sheriff. He's filed a formal complaint alleging you illegally stored hazardous materials. Claims you're framing him to avoid blame." Henry's jaw dropped. "That's absurd." Willis tapped a pen against her palm. "Don't panic yet. We haven't assigned credibility to his statement, but it raises complications. There's now a swirl of allegations going both ways." Marjorie's voice trembled with frustration. "He's turning this into a he said, she said game. Meanwhile, Oakbridge's men tried to show up. Can't you see a pattern, Agent Willis? They want to portray us as criminals so they can take the land." Willis's gaze held a flicker of empathy. "I'm not blind to the possibility. I also learned Oakbridge made a formal inquiry about a month ago, inquiring whether your property was for sale. You refused, correct?" Henry nodded. "I told them we had no interest in selling." Willis pursed her lips. "The partial serial numbers on those barrels haven't yet matched any official shipping logs. We suspect the codes may have been partially removed or falsified. But we're broadening our trace. If Oakbridge purchased from that industrial facility and withheld records, we'll find out." Marjorie clutched Henry's arm. "So you are looking that way?" "Yes," Willis answered. "But keep in mind, nothing's definitive yet. We need time to sift evidence properly." Henry and Marjorie exchanged glances, relief warring with anxiety. They knew the clock was ticking. Every day under quarantine was another day the Carsons lost business, incurred expenses, and eroded trust in the local market. He asked the question weighing on both their minds. "How much longer until you finish investigating?" Willis released a heavy breath. "We can't lift the quarantine until all contaminated zones are mapped and stable. That might take another week, possibly more. After that, it depends on how the legal side unfolds." She glanced at her watch. "I have to head to the site lab now. I'll keep you updated." With that, she climbed back into the SUV and drove off, leaving Henry and Marjorie feeling like hostages in their own pasture. Marjorie walked to the orchard's edge, the sun angled low in the sky, warm light brushing the tips of tall grass. She recalled 1,000 childhood memories, swimming in the creek, climbing the old oak at the property line. Now everything felt tarnished by the presence of chain-link fences and chemical-laden barrels. She balled her fists, sick at heart. "They can't do this forever," she muttered. Henry joined her, rubbing her shoulder gently. "We just have to hold out," he whispered. "Molly's still digging. Agent Willis is at least keeping an open mind." As dusk gathered, Henry returned to the farmhouse, rummaging through a closet until he found a battered camera he used long ago. If Oakbridge or any suspicious vehicle tried sneaking onto the farm under cover of darkness, maybe he could capture proof. He strung a small flashlight around his neck and went outside, standing on the porch, scanning the perimeter. The National Guard might guard the property from unauthorized visitors, but Henry wanted his own records in case something slipped by official eyes. Hours passed, with only the distant hum of a generator and the shuffle of soldiers patrolling the orchard. Nothing out of the ordinary. Finally, Henry retreated indoors. He double-checked the door locks, a habit he never used to bother with, and sank into an armchair, exhaustion pulling at him. Marjorie hovered nearby, a faint tension etched in her features. "We'll make it," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. "We have to believe that." Henry nodded, though doubt lingered. Tomorrow promised more tests, more scrutiny, and more attempts by Oakbridge to influence the narrative. With so many powerful forces aligned against them, the Carsons' one fragile hope rested on shining a bright enough light that no one could hide. He closed his eyes, imagining the farmland restored to quiet normalcy. That image felt painfully distant, yet he held on to it like a lifeline in the gathering darkness. The following morning brought a brisk wind that rustled through the farm's half-empty fields, carrying with it a touch of autumn's chill. Henry woke to find 2 more military vehicles had arrived in the night, their broad tires leaving deep ruts in the gravel driveway. Marjorie, bleary-eyed, peered through the window beside him. Even from inside, they could see new faces among the soldiers patrolling outside. Change was afoot, and the restless energy in the air made both Carsons uneasy. Not long after daybreak, a uniformed woman Henry didn't recognize knocked on the door. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Avery, part of the National Guard reinforcements sent to expand the quarantine perimeter. Her tone was polite yet formal as she explained that the contamination zone had widened to include a swath of creek bed beyond Henry's southern fence. "Additional safety measures," Avery said, her voice a practiced neutrality. "We believe the chemicals leached further than we first thought." The words felt like a fresh blow. Henry prided himself on maintaining healthy soil and clean water. Now the mere hint that the creek might carry toxins downstream only ramped up everyone's anxiety. Marjorie asked whether the guard had turned away any suspicious vehicles overnight, but Avery shook her head. "It's been quiet," she said. "Just an uptick in media inquiries. Our checkpoint logs show multiple news vans circling the outskirts." Hearing that the media had taken interest made Henry's stomach tighten. He'd always preferred a low-profile life. Now he was the involuntary centerpiece of a scandal. Still, if the press poked around, maybe the truth about Oakbridge would reach the public. He found himself torn between dread and cautious optimism at the prospect of cameras descending upon his land. After Lieutenant Avery departed, Marjorie proposed they do a walk-through of the orchard and fields to see if any changes had appeared overnight. "We can't rely solely on the National Guard's vigilance," she said. Henry agreed, so they donned old jackets and stepped outside, weaving among the uniformed men and women in camouflage. A few paused to nod or greet them, but most were busy calibrating equipment or conferring about new test sites. They headed east first, toward the orchard. The once verdant rows of fruit trees had lost a bit of luster in the face of all the upheaval, as if nature sensed the tension. Henry ran his hand across the bark of a pear tree, checking for the slightest sign of abnormal wilting. He found none. An odd relief in an otherwise grim situation. The orchard remained physically intact, though the soil below was a mosaic of freshly dug patches where barrels had been unearthed. Marjorie walked slowly, scanning for footprints or tire marks. "Remember that forklift operator said something about the barrels possibly coming from a plant 2 states over," she said. "I wonder if the guard found more barrels hidden deeper." They found no new evidence of digging, but as they neared the orchard's boundary, they saw Captain Rainey directing a small team carrying metal detectors. One soldier swept back and forth, headphones clamped to his ears. Another followed, marking the ground with little flags wherever the device beeped. Henry's heart pounded. Every new beep could signal the presence of additional drums, the puzzle growing darker with every find. Unable to do much else, father and daughter continued toward the fence line. Marjorie stopped short when she spotted footprints on the soft earth, distinct from the typical boot prints left by the guard. These prints seemed larger, the tread unusual. She crouched down. "Dad, look. Could be from heavy work boots, but not the same standard issue I see on the soldiers. Could be someone else snuck in." Henry's brow furrowed. "Or someone from Oakbridge tried creeping around. Maybe last night, maybe earlier." He glanced at the watchful soldiers. "We should tell them." They reported the finding to Captain Rainey, who signaled for one of his men to photograph and measure the footprints. While that process unfolded, Henry and Marjorie stepped aside, exchanging uneasy glances. Every new sign of trespass confirmed the sabotage wasn't just a one-time event. It felt orchestrated, ongoing, possibly aided by well-funded strangers who had no fear of federal agents. Around midday, the Carsons headed back to the house. In the kitchen, Marjorie rummaged through the refrigerator, pulling out leftovers from the prior night. "We can't go shopping," she said with a hollow laugh, "so we're stuck with whatever's on hand." The stress etched lines on her face that made her look older than her mid-20s. Henry tried not to dwell on the mounting sense of claustrophobia. Their farm was big enough to roam, yet the presence of armed guards and invisible fences made it feel stifling. "Let's see if we can salvage some normalcy," he said softly, helping her heat up the food. They shared a silent meal, each lost in thought. Then the door swung open without warning, and Agent Willis appeared, hair slightly askew from the wind. "Mr. Carson," she said briskly, "I've got an update. Mind if I sit?" Henry nodded, indicating the worn armchair. Marjorie perched anxiously on the edge of the sofa. Willis set down a manila envelope. Lab results came in on the orchard barrels. The chemical composition matches a solvent frequently used in manufacturing adhesives, something your typical farm wouldn't handle. We also found a partial symbol that might correspond to the shipping label of a company in the next state. We're running comparisons. Henry felt a flicker of vindication. "That's good," he said. "I keep telling you we never used anything like that." Willis nodded. "Yes, it supports your claim that the contamination was inflicted externally. However," she paused, flipping through her papers, "there's no direct paper trail yet. We're short on the shipping logs that would show exactly who purchased these solvents, and the local forklift operator who handled the barrels claims ignorance, as he was subcontracted for the dig. We do have one lead, though. The forklift was traced to a rental company used by an Oakbridge subcontractor." Marjorie's breath caught. "That ties Oakbridge to the burying, right?" Willis shrugged. "It's a link, but not conclusive. Oakbridge hires many subcontractors. They could claim a rogue employee acted without corporate knowledge. That's often how these cases go. We need something that proves corporate complicity." Henry clenched a fist on the table. "Isn't forging a petition to the federal court enough? That shell group, Green Guardians Alliance, had to be funded by someone with a motive." Willis offered a faint smile. "We are looking into it. I assure you, we're not ignoring your theories. Right now, we have to build a case carefully. If Oakbridge used Calvin Miller as an intermediary, we'll see if he left any footprints in the paper trail." After she left, Henry collapsed in the chair, torn between relief that the investigation was trending in their favor and despair that the burden of proof remained so high. Marjorie sank onto the couch, head in her hands. "Dad," she murmured, "what if none of this finishes before they drive us to bankruptcy? We can't plant new crops with half the farmland cordoned off and the other half suspect. Even if we're exonerated later, how do we rebuild?" He rubbed his temples, wishing he had answers. "We'll find a way," he said, voice raw. "Maybe we can request emergency assistance from the state." They do that sometimes for farmers hit by disasters, but that's a slow process. A knock at the open door startled them. It was Captain Rainey again, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carson, Ms. Carson," he began. We're confiscating certain farm equipment to test for chemical residue. This includes your main tractor." Marjorie let out a soft gasp. "That's our only working tractor. How are we supposed to prepare fields, even just to mow grass or feed the livestock?" Rainey looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry, but it's part of procedure. I'll make sure we expedite the analysis so it's returned if it's clean." Henry managed a nod, but inside he felt hollow. Every day took another piece of their ability to function. He helped Rainey's men load the tractor onto a flatbed truck, his chest tightening as he watched the machine, an emblem of his family's toil, rolled away under the watchful eye of armed soldiers. Once the truck disappeared down the lane, Henry sank onto a bench near the barn, fury and helplessness warring in his gut. It was then he spotted a figure lurking near the orchard fence, half hidden behind a row of shrubs. Henry squinted. The silhouette didn't match any of the soldiers. Heart pounding, he stood and motioned for Marjorie to stay back. Cautiously, he approached, weaving around the orchard's perimeter. As he drew closer, the figure darted away, footsteps crunching on the gravel. For a split second, Henry glimpsed a flash of a dark jacket, the faint sound of a muffled oath. Then the intruder vanished around the corner of a storage shed. Henry called out, but there was no response. He sprinted after the figure, only to collide with two startled soldiers. "Someone's here," he gasped. "He ran that way." The soldiers radioed for backup and gave chase, but by the time they reached the storage shed, it was empty. No footprints, no sign of the trespasser. Henry scanned the horizon, frustration pulsing in his veins. He knew he hadn't imagined it. Someone was snooping, maybe searching for an item left behind, or trying to gauge the investigation's progress. Another piece of the puzzle, but no solid answers. Marjorie rushed up, panting. "Did you see his face?" "No," Henry ground out. "Just a glimpse of a jacket. He was definitely not one of the guard. Probably Oakbridge, or Calvin's associate, or who knows who else. They're brave, sneaking around with the property swarming with soldiers." Captain Rainey joined them, face grim. "We'll double patrol around the orchard," he said. "I'll inform Agent Willis. If that intruder left any trace, we'll find it." Henry rubbed the sweat from his brow, a sense of dread settling in. These enemies were bold. If they believed they could slip past a military quarantine, they must have powerful backing or a desperate need to hide something incriminating. The possibility that more evidence was hidden on the farm gnawed at him. He didn't know whether to hope the intruder left clues or fear that they managed to remove them. As dusk fell, Henry and Marjorie reconvened at the farmhouse, huddling over a dim kitchen lamp to talk strategy. They agreed to keep an eye on the orchard overnight, taking turns staying awake. Perhaps they could catch whoever was creeping around. Neither was eager to confront criminals alone, but the sense of urgency loomed. They had to protect their land from any further sabotage, or else this nightmare would never end. Staring out at the orchard's dark silhouette, Henry steeled himself for another long, sleepless vigil. The truth felt maddeningly close, swirling in rumors and half-buried clues. But until the forces behind the sabotage were fully exposed, the Carsons remained trapped beneath suspicion, teetering on the edge of ruin. And so he sat, determined not to blink, convinced that somewhere in that moonlit field lay the key to saving his family's heritage. Henry Carson sat on the porch swing, cradling an old flashlight in his lap while the nighttime chill settled over the farm. A single lantern cast faint light across the steps, revealing the tension in his posture. Just a few yards away, Marjorie leaned against a wooden post, binoculars trained on the orchard rows. They had taken these positions after supper, determined to keep watch until dawn if necessary. The National Guard patrolled certain areas, but Henry wasn't convinced they had eyes on every corner. He exchanged a whispered word with Marjorie, asking if she'd noticed anything. She shook her head, the binoculars pressing into her cheeks. "It's quiet," she murmured. "Too quiet, maybe." Every so often a soldier's silhouette strode past the orchard, flashlight beams bobbing across the ground, but there was no sign of the shadowy figure Henry had chased earlier that day. Time dragged. Now and then, Henry rose to stretch his legs, pacing along the porch's edge. Despite the tension, the farmland looked strangely peaceful under the moonlight. Stars glittered above, and the orchard leaves rippled like silver in the faint breeze, yet each soft rustle of branches made Henry's heart jump. He refused to let his guard down. Around midnight, Marjorie's cell phone, one of the few communication devices they hadn't turned over, buzzed with a text from a friend in town. The message read, "Saw your farm on the news. Reporter saying more barrels found. People think you're polluters. So sorry." Marjorie exhaled slowly, showing the message to Henry. The story had spread quickly, it seemed, and the narrative remained skewed against them. Henry felt an ache behind his eyes. He pictured the gossip in town, old acquaintances shaking their heads in disapproval. Years of building trust could be undone by a handful of sensational headlines. "If we can just hold on," he said quietly. "Maybe Agent Willis will pin this on Oak Bridge. Then everyone will see we're the victims." Marjorie tried to smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so," she replied. "But we can't wait forever for a break." She fidgeted, adjusting the binoculars. "Look at how they're systematically destroying our reputation. If we don't fight back, we'll have nothing left to save." Not 5 minutes later, the orchard security lights flickered. Henry froze, heart hammering. That lighting system was powered by a portable generator the guard had set up. It rarely faltered, unless someone tampered with it or the fuel ran low. He stood up. "Did you see that?" Marjorie lowered the binoculars, brow furrowed. "Yes? Maybe a glitch?" A soldier's voice drifted across the darkness, calling for someone to check the generator. Henry saw beams of flashlights converge on the orchard's far side. The lights flickered again, then stabilized. He let out a breath, tension easing slightly. But then a motion at the corner of his eye. A figure darted between two trees on the orchard's left flank. Henry whipped the flashlight around, but the shape vanished too quickly. He grabbed Marjorie's arm. "There," he whispered, pointing. "Did you catch it?" She shook her head. "No, but if you saw something, we should move. Let's circle around from the eastern edge." They slipped off the porch, avoiding the main paths the guard used. Henry led the way through a patch of knee-high grass, Marjorie close behind. The orchard's overhead lights cast wavering shadows, making every trunk and branch seem alive. Occasionally they spotted soldiers with flashlights, but none seemed to notice the Carsons creeping beyond the bright perimeter. The orchard smelled of leaves and ripening fruit, a scent Henry normally found comforting. Tonight it felt laced with dread. He heard his own heartbeat, worried that any noise might tip off whoever lurked among the trees. As they edged around a cluster of trunks, he glimpsed movement again, a silhouette crouching near the ground. He gestured for Marjorie to stay low. Together they advanced another few yards. Now Henry could see a figure, faced away, fiddling with something in the soil. He tried to steady his breathing. If he shouted for the soldiers, would this stranger bolt again? Or was it safer to approach quietly? Before Henry could decide, the figure straightened, turned, and looked directly at them. For a split second, Henry saw a face partially covered by a dark cap. Fear flashed in the stranger's eyes. Then the intruder sprinted deeper into the orchard. Henry yelled, "Hey!" and charged forward, Marjorie right behind him. Branches whipped at Henry's arms as he pursued. His flashlight beam danced over trunks and tall grass, but the figure was quick, weaving between rows of trees. The orchard lights flickered a third time, making everything lurch in strobing shadows. Marjorie cried out, "He's heading toward the creek!" Henry changed direction, racing to intercept. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the intruder skidding to a halt near the orchard's outer edge, confronted by a soldier's sudden shout. The soldier aimed a rifle, ordering the figure to freeze, but the stranger pivoted, ducked, and vanished into the darkness. The soldier fired a warning shot into the air, the crack echoing among the trees. By the time Henry and Marjorie arrived, panting, the soldier stood alone, scanning with a flashlight. "Did you see which way he went?" Henry asked, voice ragged. The soldier shook his head, frustrated. "Slipped past me. Fast little devil." They found footprints in the soft ground, distinct enough to show that someone had definitely been prowling. A second soldier arrived, and soon Captain Rainey stormed into view, demanding an update. Once again, the orchard had been infiltrated despite the heavy guard presence. Rainey ordered extra patrols and told Henry and Marjorie to return to the farmhouse for their own safety. The captain's exasperation was clear. He wanted no civilian entanglement if there were potentially armed trespassers, but Henry refused to retreat. "Captain," he insisted, "this is our land. We saw him tampering with the dirt. Let us help search." Despite Henry's protests, Rainey maintained that the orchard was now a zone of heightened risk. Under direct orders, Henry and Marjorie found themselves escorted back home, left to stew in frustration. Once inside, they paced, heart still thumping from the chase. "It's the same man or group," Marjorie said, face flushed. "They keep returning. They must be trying to hide or remove evidence. Maybe more barrels, or maybe they planted something new." Henry raked a hand through his hair. "Yeah, or they're checking to see if we've discovered all of their stashes. They might have hidden additional documentation, or a phone, or something that ties Oakbridge to this mess. If only we could catch them in the act." An hour later, Agent Willis arrived, escorted by 2 soldiers who stayed posted near the door. She listened closely as Henry and Marjorie described the chase. The mention of flickering lights drew her attention. "Sabotaging the generator could be a distraction," she said, drumming her fingers on the table. "They create a brief window of darkness to slip around the orchard." Marjorie leaned in. "Agent Willis, they must be terrified you'll find something. Doesn't that prove we're telling the truth about sabotage?" Willis met her gaze. "It strongly suggests someone's determined to alter the scene or recover incriminating materials. But we need tangible proof. Still no positive ID on this intruder," Henry pressed. "What about those footprints we found earlier? Any match with known suspects?" Willis sighed. "The treads differ from standard shoes, so we suspect a contractor or field worker. Nothing conclusive. We're analyzing a partial shoe print from the orchard's north side, but it could take days to get results. Meanwhile, Oakbridge denies sending any personnel." A wave of despair pushed at Henry. "We can't keep watching this happen. They'll slip in again, sabotage more areas, or remove more evidence. Each time they're a step ahead." Willis's eyes flickered with empathy. "I understand. My team's working as fast as possible, but these cases can turn into cat and mouse. We're increasing overnight patrols in the orchard. I suggest you stay indoors for your own safety." Her voice softened. "I know it's your home, but please trust we're doing our best to root out the truth." After she left, Henry sank into the sofa, exhaustion draping him like a heavy blanket. Marjorie took a seat across from him, their gazes meeting in grim solidarity. "Looks like we can't do much but wait," she murmured. "I hate being so powerless." Henry's fists clenched involuntarily. "Me too. But if there's a bright side, it's that these intruders keep showing up. The more they return, the more likely they'll slip up. And as soon as the guard catches them in possession of something incriminating, we can blow this wide open." The night wore on in uneasy quiet. Outside, soldiers patrolled with renewed vigilance, scanning the orchard and fence lines. The orchard lights no longer flickered. Someone must have stabilized the generator. The intrusive hush felt unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Finally, near 3 in the morning, Henry managed to fall asleep in his armchair, lulled by sheer fatigue. Marjorie dozed on the couch, arms folded against the chill. It wasn't proper rest, just a fitful doze haunted by half-formed dreams of men in dark jackets and buried barrels. But at least it offered a brief escape from the relentless worry. When dawn broke, Henry stirred awake, stiff joints protesting. He stood, rubbed his eyes, and peeked out the window. The orchard glowed in early sunlight, dew clinging to leaves. National Guard vehicles dotted the property like steadfast sentinels. No commotion, no new alarms. Perhaps the intruder hadn't returned after all. Marjorie stretched and joined him by the window. "A quiet morning," she said softly. "I guess we should be thankful for small mercies." He nodded, fleetingly grateful for normalcy. Yet beneath the calm surface he felt the tension winding ever tighter. This respite, however welcome, couldn't last long. As the sun inched higher, Henry resolved that if the intruder was truly after hidden evidence, the Carsons had better help the authorities search every corner of that orchard themselves. If they found something first, they might finally force the truth out into the open and save the farm before Oakbridge could seal its fate. In the crisp morning light, Henry Carson and Marjorie stood on the porch, sipping hastily made coffee while surveying the orchard that had become a hotbed of intrigue. Soldiers still roamed between the rows, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of last night's intruder. Although the morning air carried a hint of dew and serenity, neither Henry nor his daughter felt at ease. Their brief, troubled sleep had done little to erase the tension etched into every corner of the farm. Both were convinced that hidden clues lay scattered beneath the orchard's canopy, waiting to be found before the saboteurs could erase them forever. After finishing the lukewarm coffee, they decided on a plan. With permission from Captain Rainey, they would conduct a systematic survey of the orchard during the day, accompanied by a couple of soldiers for safety. Perhaps, Henry reasoned, a focused search might turn up overlooked evidence. A scrap of paper, a broken tool, tire ruts from a stealth vehicle. Marjorie suggested they also check any old storage sheds or outbuildings near the orchard's boundary. The intruder could have stashed something incriminating where no one would think to look. So after a quick word to confirm with Rainey, they gathered up gloves, notepads, and small flashlights, ready for whatever the orchard might reveal. Captain Rainey agreed, though he insisted on assigning 2 soldiers to accompany them. One was Corporal Diaz, a tall woman with a calm demeanor, and the other was Private Bell, fresh-faced but keenly alert. The foursome headed into the orchard shortly after 9, the sunlight turning the leaves a vibrant green gold. As they walked, Henry felt a strange mix of nostalgia and apprehension. He recalled teaching Marjorie to prune the fruit trees years ago, a simpler time before sabotage and swirling accusations. Now every rustle made him wonder if hostile eyes were watching from some hidden vantage. They started at the northern edge, where the soldier had discovered footprints days earlier. Diaz led them in a grid-like pattern, scanning the ground while Henry peered among tree roots, and Marjorie inspected low-hanging branches. The orchard was fairly orderly. Henry had always taken pride in neat rows, but fallen leaves and bits of brush provided countless hiding spots. After an hour of painstaking search, they paused near a cluster of pear trees, disappointed at finding only stray wrappers and the occasional small animal burrow. Still, Henry wouldn't let discouragement take root. One crucial scrap of evidence could shift the entire investigation in their favor. Private Bell pointed out a row of low storage sheds near the fence line, half hidden by tangled shrubs. "Sir," he said, turning to Henry, "what do you keep in those sheds? They look like they haven't been used in a while." Henry admitted those sheds held mostly old equipment, rusted plows, worn-out irrigation parts, outdated pesticide sprayers. There was no reason for him to visit them lately, which made them ideal for someone else to exploit. With fresh determination, they forged a path through the overgrowth toward the closest shed, the boards on its walls gray and weathered from years of neglect. The shed's door creaked ominously when Henry pried it open. Inside, stale air assaulted their senses, smelling of dust, oil, and decay. Marjorie flicked on her flashlight, shining it across cobwebbed corners. The soldier duo followed close behind, rifles lowered but ready, scanning for any sign of tampering. Henry recognized the silhouette of a broken cultivator blade leaning against the far wall, exactly where he'd left it long ago. But scattered on the ground were fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been here recently, and not just once. A line of boot prints led to a rear corner where old cardboard boxes sat half-collapsed atop each other. Marjorie crouched down, carefully shifting the topmost box. It disintegrated at her touch, the cardboard crumbling with age. Beneath it lay another box, less battered, marked with water stains but sealed tightly. She glanced at Henry, brow raised. "Dad, did you put this one here?" He shook his head. He had no recollection of a sealed box in that corner. Heart pounding, Marjorie tugged at the lid, which peeled back to reveal a cluster of black plastic bags. The smell of chemicals wafted out, sharp and unpleasant. She hissed, pulling her face away. Corporal Diaz stepped forward, shining a flashlight over Marjorie's shoulder. "Careful," Diaz said. "We need to see if that's the same sort of stuff the lab's testing." She slipped on gloves, opened one bag, and revealed a container of what appeared to be dried residue. The container was unmarked. Another bag held plastic vials, also unlabeled. A third had crusted lumps of something that looked vaguely like fertilizer pellets, but the odor seemed wrong. Too acrid. There was no question. The contents were suspicious and potentially dangerous. Henry's mouth went dry. "This must belong to them," he breathed, hardly daring to believe they'd stumbled on such a find. "They've been using my old shed as a drop site." Marjorie's eyes gleamed with a mix of anger and triumph. "If the lab can match these substances to the orchard barrels or the contaminated soil," she said, "that's huge. Proof someone's been planting toxins here." Diaz signaled Bell to radio for backup, instructing him to bring a hazmat team. While they waited, the four examined the footprints more closely. They were the same unusual tread Henry had seen near the orchard fence, reinforcing the idea that the same intruder returned multiple times to hide or retrieve contraband. This time, at least, the saboteur hadn't succeeded in removing the evidence. When the hazmat unit arrived, two soldiers in protective suits carefully packed each suspicious item into sealed crates. Henry watched them cart out the boxes, his pulse pounding with hope. If these materials linked to Oakbridge or its subcontractors, the Carsons might finally break free from the cloud of suspicion. As the day wore on, news of the shed discovery reverberated across the quarantined farm. Agent Willis arrived in a hurry, carefully reviewing the initial inventory of recovered chemicals. Her eyes shone with excitement when she confirmed that some containers matched residue found in the orchard barrels. This was the most concrete lead yet, and for once, she spoke to Henry and Marjorie with genuine encouragement. "We'll run thorough tests," Willis said. "If these match the solvents from that out-of-state manufacturer, we'll have a direct link to whoever smuggled them onto your property." Marjorie pressed. "Do you think you can trace them to Oakbridge, or prove Calvin Miller was involved?" Willis remained cautious, explaining that final conclusions depended on the lab's results and the chain of custody for the chemicals. But she admitted that the hidden stash in Carson's old shed was a major development. "No innocent reason for these to be here," she stated. "Someone's going to have a lot of explaining to do." Henry felt a measure of relief so profound he nearly laughed, though the tension kept a lid on any real joy. They had discovered a potential smoking gun. Yet he knew better than to celebrate early. Oakbridge's lawyers, or any hidden conspirators, might still maneuver to dodge full culpability. He also worried about Calvin, who might try one last desperate move if he sensed the net closing in. Throughout the afternoon, soldiers guarded the shed, awaiting forensic teams who would dust for fingerprints and examine the footprints more thoroughly. Marjorie decided to stay on site, offering to answer questions or show investigators how the orchard and sheds connected. Meanwhile, Henry wandered back to the farmhouse, longing for a moment of solitude. He settled at the kitchen table with a glass of water, letting his mind swirl over the implications of what they'd found. His hand drifted to the battered flip phone, the direct line to Molly Brandt. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed her number. When she answered, he kept his voice hushed, excitement laced with caution. "Molly, we found a stash of chemicals in one of my old sheds," he said, describing the unlabeled containers and suspicious footprints. "The feds are analyzing it now. Might be the proof we need to tie Oakbridge to the contamination." Molly's voice brimmed with energy. "That's fantastic. And I've got news of my own. I convinced a frightened clerk from Oakbridge's legal department to share partial shipping invoices. Several mentioned shipments of industrial-grade solvents not accounted for in public records. She's terrified of losing her job, maybe more. But I believe she'll help confirm the link." Henry's heart thudded with hope. "If we put your evidence together with the Fed's new find—" "Exactly," Molly cut in. "We could blow this case wide open. But Henry, be careful. Oakbridge or their hired goons might double down now that you've uncovered physical proof. Watch your back." He thanked her, promising to stay vigilant. Hanging up, he breathed deeply. The first time in weeks he felt a genuine surge of optimism. Outside, the orchard hummed with activity as forensic teams combed the shed for trace evidence. Maybe, just maybe, the Carsons would soon be exonerated. Still, Henry refused to ignore Molly's warning. He looked around the room at the half-packed boxes of personal items, mementos he and Marjorie had stashed away in case they had to flee under legal threat. The farm might be saved, but they weren't out of danger yet. Dark forces had orchestrated this scheme, and cornered conspirators often lashed out. Pushing away the worst thoughts, Henry decided to focus on the small victories. They finally had a tangible thread that could unravel Oakbridge's sabotage. By early evening, Agent Willis stopped by with an encouraging nod, explaining that initial tests on the shed chemicals strongly hinted at the same composition as the orchard barrels. "This evidence significantly shifts the investigation," she said. "I'll recommend narrowing the suspect list to those who had reason to hide contraband here." Henry suppressed a smile, not wanting to appear smug. Instead, he expressed gratitude that she was following the trail. Marjorie, hearing the news, actually allowed a brief grin of relief to pass over her face. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the Carsons were no longer alone on the defensive. As shadows lengthened across the property, Henry and Marjorie stood at the orchard's edge, watching the final rays of sun drift behind rolling hills. Soldiers still prowled the perimeter, but the mood seemed different, charged with purpose rather than suspicion. Henry slipped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "We might get through this after all," he murmured. She nodded, eyes shining with pent-up tears. If the orchard's final secret had been uncovered, the truth could at last be set free. Late evening descended upon the Carson farm with an air of restless anticipation. Illuminated by floodlights and the occasional flashlight beams, the orchard looked like a stage set for confrontation. Soldiers in pairs combed the rows one last time before nightfall, while forensic specialists in protective clothing concluded their examination of the newly discovered stash in the old storage shed. In the farmhouse, Henry and Marjorie huddled around the kitchen table. They had tidied it for the umpteenth time that week, but the looming investigation left them too keyed up to relax. The sporadic hum of a distant generator, the muted voices of the National Guard outside, it all underscored how far from normal their lives had become. At least now they had hoped the nightmare would end. A brisk knock sounded at the door. Agent Willis stepped in, looking more tired than usual. She held a folder thick with fresh notes and handed it off to one of the soldiers trailing behind her. "I have good news and an urgent warning," she said without preamble, eyes flicking between father and daughter. Marjorie's breath caught. Good news? Did the lab confirm a link to Oakbridge? Willis gave a taut nod. Preliminary analysis of the shed materials matches the orchard barrels. Chemical fingerprints point to a specific manufacturer in the next state, whose largest commercial client is indeed Oakbridge Development. We're still waiting on shipping records to see if those exact lots were purchased by Oakbridge or one of their subcontractors. But it's an extremely strong indicator you didn't cause this yourself. A weight seemed to lift from Henry's chest, even as he gripped the edge of the table. That means we're closer to proving our innocence? He asked. They can't keep us under suspicion much longer. Willis sighed, looking sympathetic. Officially, I still can't release you from the quarantine. Contamination remains. But yes, it appears you were deliberately targeted. I'll be requesting the Department of Justice to open an investigation into Oakbridge's involvement. Marjorie felt a surging gratitude, but Willis's mention of a warning sobered them. She braced herself. And the urgent part? She prompted. Willis's expression darkened. We have intel that certain private security contractors linked to Oakbridge may escalate measures to conceal evidence. One of my colleagues intercepted chatter hinting that someone plans to remove remaining obstacles. We don't know if it means destroying more property, intimidating witnesses, or worse. Please stay inside at night. And if you see anything suspicious, alert us immediately. Henry swallowed hard. They might come after us directly, he said, voice low. Why am I not surprised? Willis gave a curt nod. Captain Rainey has orders to increase patrols. With luck, that'll deter any attempt. But these people seem determined. After she left, Marjorie leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to process it all. She saw Henry run a hand through his hair, face etched with concern. Dad, she said quietly, maybe we should sleep in one room tonight. Keep watching shifts again. If they're that desperate, who knows what they'll try. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Agreed. We'll block the doors, too. Can't be too careful. At least the soldiers outside give us some protection. They spent the next hour securing windows and doors. Henry improvised a simple barricade for the back door, a stout piece of lumber across the frame. The tension in the air was palpable, each small sound amplified by their nerves. Nonetheless, they refused to give in to fear completely. Tonight, the orchard was lit up like a fortress, and the National Guard was fully alert to the possibility of trouble. Marjorie retreated to the living room couch with a pillow and blanket, while Henry settled into an old recliner facing the front window. He balanced the battered flip phone on one armrest, just in case Molly Brandt called. By 10 o'clock, the hush outside felt eerie. No more vehicles rumbled in. Most soldiers had positioned themselves out of sight, staking out vantage points around the orchard. An uneasy calm enveloped the farm. Hours crawled by. Marjorie dozed off, her breathing shallow, but Henry found sleep elusive. He flicked off the lamp to watch outside more clearly. The moon was half hidden by clouds, lending the orchard a halo of shifting shadows. Any normal autumn night, he might have listened to crickets or stared at the stars. Tonight, he stared out the window, half expecting a stealthy figure to emerge. Near midnight, something stirred at the far edge of the yard, near the tool shed. He narrowed his eyes and saw a faint glimmer of movement. Slowly, he rose from the recliner, stepping carefully toward the window to peer out. A soldier, perhaps. The shape was too dark and indistinct. His heart thumped heavily. Then, from the orchard side, a beam of light slashed across the darkness. One of the guard's searchlights. In that instant, Henry glimpsed a person wearing dark clothing, ducking near the tool shed door. He inhaled sharply. This wasn't a soldier. The standard issue fatigues reflected light differently, and guards rarely moved alone. Anger surged. These trespassers were brazen enough to try again, even with the orchard on lockdown. He pressed his phone to his ear, whispering Agent Willis's direct line. Static, then her soft voice. "Willis here." "This is Henry," he whispered urgently, glancing at Marjorie, who stirred awake. "There's someone by the tool shed at the east corner of the yard. Not a soldier. They're trying to break in." "Hang tight," Willis said. "I'll alert Captain Rainey. Do not engage." Henry ended the call, adrenaline pounding. A part of him wanted to run outside with a flashlight and confront the intruder, but he knew better. These criminals were likely armed or desperate, or both. Better to let the professionals handle it. Marjorie, now fully awake, scrambled to her feet, peering out the window. "I see them, Dad," she breathed. "They're messing with the lock." Spotlights flared from two sides, illuminating the yard in a harsh glow. Henry glimpsed soldiers rushing toward the shed, weapons raised. For a brief second, the intruder froze like a rabbit caught in headlights. Then came shouting. Henry recognized Captain Rainey's voice. The dark figure bolted, feet pounding on gravel. Soldiers fanned out, yelling commands. A single shot rang out, followed by several more. Henry jerked back instinctively. Marjorie gasped, pressing a hand over her mouth. The next few moments blurred. Shouts, rustling movement through the orchard, the crackle of radio calls. Henry and Marjorie stood transfixed, pulses hammering. Outside, flashlights bobbed frantically. Then the orchard lights glared brighter, and a pair of soldiers emerged, half carrying a man in dark clothing who clutched an injured arm. Even from the window, Henry saw blood seeping through the man's sleeve. The man stumbled, cursing in muffled anger or pain. Captain Rainey approached them, barking orders to secure the perimeter. Another soldier quickly frisked the intruder, removing a small sidearm from his belt. Marjorie caught her breath. This was no idle trespasser, then. He was armed. Someone pressed him to the ground, handcuffing him. From the figure's body language, Henry guessed he was furious, possibly terrified. Within minutes, Agent Willis arrived, stepping out of her SUV with urgent strides. She knelt beside the cuffed intruder, speaking to him in a tone Henry couldn't hear. All Henry could see was the man shaking his head and then shouting something incoherent. Soldiers parted, letting Willis examine his pockets. Eventually, she lifted a cell phone and a crumpled folder page, holding them aloft in the glare of headlights. Henry turned to Marjorie, a swirl of relief and shock dancing in his eyes. "They caught him," he whispered. "Finally." She nodded, swallowing hard. "We're safe," she said, though her voice trembled with the aftershock. "Dad? This must be the break we need. They'll question him, find out who sent him. Maybe it's Oakbridge's hired goon." They remained inside, following Willis's advice not to intervene. Through the window, they watched medical personnel wrap the intruder's injured arm, presumably grazed by a bullet. Captain Rainey radioed for an ambulance to ensure the wound wasn't life-threatening. Then, with a gesture, Rainey signaled for soldiers to bring the man to a more secure location, likely the makeshift command center near the barn. In the quiet that followed, Henry and Marjorie slumped onto the living room couch, minds racing. "I can't believe it," Marjorie said, voice hushed. "We've been waiting for this moment, but now that it's here, it feels so surreal." Henry exhaled a shuddering breath. "I just hope he talks. If he's part of the Oakbridge plot or Calvin's hired muscle, we can finally prove it." Outside, the yard remained ablaze with spotlights, soldiers moving in purposeful strides. The orchard, so recently a place of fear, now served as the scene of a critical arrest. Henry allowed himself a tremulous smile. They expected Agent Willis to come to the farmhouse immediately with details, but she remained busy for an hour, presumably interrogating the suspect and coordinating with the guard. At last, the door opened and Willis entered, face taut. "The man we apprehended had a gun and was tampering with the tool shed lock. He claims he's just a security consultant investigating contamination, but we found a text thread in his phone referencing instructions to remove files or materials from this farm." Marjorie's eyes widened. So he was here to destroy evidence. Willis's mouth pressed into a grim line. That's the implication. He's not cooperating, but we suspect he's connected to Oakbridge's subcontractors. We'll pursue a formal interview under federal custody. He had partial instructions mentioning code phrases, likely referencing those chemicals. This arrest might open the door to bigger fish. Henry's relief mingled with lingering fear. Agent Willis, how long will this take? We can't stay under quarantine forever. She nodded, understanding. We'll expedite. The presence of an armed trespasser on top of the hidden chemicals pushes this into high priority. I'll contact my superiors first thing in the morning. If we can tie this guy directly to Oakbridge, your quarantine may be lifted sooner, at least partially. She paused. In the meantime, stay vigilant. Others might still try to slip in if they think there's more evidence to erase. When she left, father and daughter exchanged exhausted but hopeful smiles. They embraced briefly in the lamplight, neither speaking yet both understanding how close they'd come to real danger. At last, there was tangible proof of criminal conspiracy. A hired operative, armed and caught red-handed. Marjorie let out a long, shaky breath. We're almost there, Dad. I can feel it. Henry gripped her hand, nodding. Me too, he said softly. Tomorrow's interrogation might reveal names, documents, or direct orders. And if that chain led squarely to Oakbridge, the Carsons could finally reclaim their farm's integrity. Outside, soldiers continued patrolling, but with fresh confidence. The orchard, lit by a waning moon and the unwavering floodlights, seemed less foreboding now. Henry gazed through the window, imagining what it would be like to see those lights gone, the fences removed, and the orchard returning to its simple tranquility. They weren't free yet, but the path forward had grown clearer. They would see this through, one step at a time, until the day Oakbridge's scheme crumbled under the weight of the truth. Morning dawned crisp and bright, revealing the first hints of an autumn chill in the air. Henry Carson and his daughter, Marjorie, stood at the kitchen window, studying the orchard beyond. Overnight, the orchard had transformed yet again into a scene of heightened vigilance. Soldiers guarded the perimeter, while Agent Willis supervised the interrogation of the trespasser caught lurking at the shed. The tension, though still present, now carried a sharper current of hope. A corner had been turned. Not long after sunrise, Captain Rainey knocked on the door. He wore the same firm expression as always, but Henry thought he glimpsed relief in the man's eyes. "Morning, sir," Rainey said, voice level. "Agent Willis would like you both to come to the command center near the barn. We've got some developments." Henry and Marjorie wasted no time throwing on jackets. Stepping outside, they followed Rainey across the yard, where bright daylight made the orchard's leaves shimmer faintly with dew. At the barn, a makeshift table and folding chairs had been set up, and Willis stood beside them, sifting through documents. A short, gray-haired man in a dark suit waited nearby, looking official and impatient. "Mr. Carson." "Miss Carson," Willis greeted, her expression genuinely upbeat for the first time in weeks. "I'd like you to meet Gerald Brooks from the Department of Justice's regional office. He flew in overnight after hearing about last night's arrest." Brooks extended a curt handshake. "We've received preliminary intel from the suspect's phone," he said, voice clipped. "Text messages to a contact identified as Oak Ops Manager. Reference instructions to remove leftover hazard evidence orchard location. This strongly indicates a direct link to Oakbridge." Marjorie felt a dizzying surge of relief. "So that's it, right? Proof Oakbridge orchestrated the sabotage?" Brooks pushed his glasses higher on his nose. "It's compelling, but we still need a confession or unassailable shipping records to lock in a prosecutable case. Our suspect is stonewalling. However, thanks to Agent Willis's coordination, we're about to serve a warrant on Oakbridge's local offices. If we find any mention of your property in their internal memos or documents referencing the chemicals discovered here, we'll have what we need." Henry's chest constricted with cautious optimism. "That means you might lift the quarantine soon?" Willis nodded. "If we confirm you were strictly the victim, we can push to release your farm from enforced lockdown. That said, the soil contamination is real. Environmental crews will remain to ensure cleanup, but the legal restrictions should ease." Captain Rainey, standing with arms folded, offered a rare smile. "I know how hard this has been. With these new leads, you're no longer under direct suspicion. We'll reclassify your status to cooperating witnesses, pending final lab results." It took all of Henry's restraint not to sag with relief. Marjorie grabbed his arm, eyes shining. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Finally, the official stance aligned with what they'd known all along. Brooks stepped aside to take a call, murmuring about legal procedures. Meanwhile, Willis gave Henry a frank look. "We also uncovered evidence that Calvin Miller was in contact with Oakbridge's local rep. We suspect he helped coordinate, possibly out of personal vendetta. But the bulk of the operation seems to have come from Oakbridge's higher-ups. Miller may face conspiracy charges if enough proof surfaces." Marjorie pressed her lips together, torn between anger and pity for the neighbor who had once been a mere rival over water rights. "I can't believe he'd stoop so low," she said quietly. "But I guess we should have known he'd do anything to force us out." Henry bowed his head, remembering better days when neighborly disputes never crossed lines like these. "If it means justice is served," he said, voice subdued, "then so be it." They spent the rest of the morning giving detailed statements once again, recounting every shred of memory about the sabotage, the orchard barrels, and the suspicious visits. Though they'd repeated themselves often, now each statement felt more purposeful, adding weight to an inevitable case against Oakbridge. Throughout the process, Henry kept thinking of what it would mean to farm in peace again. Perhaps, with official eyes turned to the real culprits, he and Marjorie could salvage this year's harvest, at least partially, and rebuild their reputation. After finishing the paperwork, Henry led Agent Willis to the orchard's southern boundary. There, more contaminated soil samples were being bagged by environmental technicians in hazmat suits. Willis nodded, watching the work with a critical eye. "It won't be an instant fix," she said. "But the environmental agencies will coordinate a cleanup plan. You might qualify for federal aid once you're exonerated." Henry inhaled the crisp air, allowing himself to picture life beyond barbed wire and suspicion. "I'm grateful," he murmured. "Even if it's a long road, at least we're not facing it alone now." Shortly after noon, the swirling activity around the barn intensified as phone calls crackled with updates from Brooks's warrant execution. Word arrived that Oakbridge's local office was locked down by federal agents, documents seized, computers imaged. A hush fell among the National Guard men and women, as if they sensed a climactic turning point. Henry and Marjorie lingered near the barn, hearts pounding with each new snippet of news. The possibility that Oakbridge might be exposed once and for all left them trembling with both excitement and trepidation. Finally, Brooks emerged from an impromptu mobile communications trailer, waving them over. "We've secured multiple internal emails referencing this property by name," he announced, voice taut with triumph. Mentions of burying excess industrial solvents and using a proxy petition to trigger a federal seizure for forced sale. The chain leads up the corporate hierarchy. Someone high-level authorized it. We're going to recommend immediate charges. Marjorie exhaled in a rush, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry closed his eyes, staving off tears that threatened to blur his vision. This was the confirmation they needed. Agent Willis placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, a faint smile playing on her lips. "That's it then. Oakbridge is caught." A swirl of emotions raced through father and daughter. Relief, anger at the destruction wrought, sorrow for the weeks of chaos. Yet overshadowing all was gratitude that the truth had emerged. Now they could begin repairing the damage. Brooks explained that while the legal battle would continue in court, the Carsons were essentially cleared of wrongdoing. By evening, formal steps would start to rescind the quarantine, with the National Guard gradually pulling out once the environmental cleanup plan was in place. Henry's shoulders sagged in profound exhaustion. "Thank you," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I just want to take care of my farm." Brooks nodded, expression firm. "We'll do our job ensuring Oakbridge and any conspirators are held accountable. My advice is to keep records of every loss you've suffered. You'll have grounds for restitution once the civil suits commence." That afternoon, as word spread of Oakbridge's imminent downfall, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Soldiers began dismantling some of the fencing near the orchard, though they left markers around contaminated zones for ongoing lab work. Captain Rainey approached Henry with a handshake that carried genuine warmth. "We'll remain until the contamination is stabilized," Rainey said. "But soon you'll have your land back. Thank you for your patience." Henry only nodded, words failing him. Nearby, Marjorie stood under the orchard's dappled light, tears glistening as she ran her hands over the bark of a pear tree. She whispered something to the effect of, "We're free." Henry joined her, placing an arm around her shoulders. For a moment they stood in silence, letting the orchard's quiet presence soothe them. Despite the scars of barrels and sabotage, the orchard remained a place of beauty. Later, in the waning light of late afternoon, Agent Willis made a final stop by the farmhouse. She brought official documents indicating that the Carsons were no longer under direct investigation, their status changed to victims and key witnesses. With a small smile, she also returned Henry's confiscated tractor, the metal gleaming slightly under newly installed parts. "It passed all tests," she said. "You're good to go, Mr. Carson." He gripped the tractor's steering wheel, feeling an overwhelming surge of relief. It was a symbol of their livelihood, returned at last. Marjorie laughed through tears, patting the old machine's side. Even the noise of the orchard's generator seemed less oppressive now. As evening settled, the Carsons ventured out along the creek bed, noticing fresh warning signs posted by environmental crews. There was still a ways to go. Soil monitoring, legal depositions, possible medical screenings for them and their livestock. Yet the colossal threat of losing the farm or facing criminal charges had been lifted. That night, with the orchard partially roped off for continuing tests, Henry and Marjorie shared a modest dinner, the first in weeks where the specter of sabotage didn't weigh them down. They ate quietly, letting the soft lamplight cloak them in a rare peace. Afterward, Marjorie suggested they walk under the stars. For the first time in a month, no soldier insisted they stay indoors. The orchard lights were dimmer now, only illuminating the immediate testing sites. They strolled through the nearest row of pear trees, inhaling the scent of damp earth and leaves. Overhead, stars shimmered in a vast expanse, no longer drowned out by floodlights. Henry exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing by degrees. "I almost forgot what nights here felt like," he murmured. Marjorie nodded, slipping her arm through his. "We'll still have challenges, Dad. Cleanup, lawsuits, but at least we can do it without fear. This land is ours, and now everyone knows we're not criminals." He squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her presence. Their orchard would need time to recover from the barrels of toxins, and the damage Oakbridge had done would not vanish overnight. But the Carsons' name was clear. The sabotage exposed, and the unstoppable momentum of truth had turned in their favor. Standing under that sky, father and daughter allowed themselves a quiet moment of gratitude and resolve. Whatever trials lay ahead, they had reclaimed their right to cultivate their family farm in peace.